problem with the pastorate is the dimensions. One day you're doing a funeral, the next day you're doing a wedding. One day you're preaching on this, the next day you're being pulled in this way. The problem with pastoring is you're getting paid weekly to tell people how bad they are.
Welcome to the broadcast. This is Michael Easley in Context, and today my guest is Mike Minter. Mike was born in Providence, Rhode Island, to a Navy family. He then went to the Naval Academy, but he traveled Europe, and during 1970 he came to Christ. That experience moved him for a longing for ministry. So in 1970 he went down to the Florida Bible College, where he would graduate in 1974. He would marry Kay along the way, and he and Kay started a home Bible study in Reston, Virginia. That home Bible study would move the following year to a hotel in 1975, and Mike would then find Reston Bible Church, where he pastored for over 45 years. He's now retired from Reston. He's moved to Franklin, Tennessee, where all good Christians move when they retire. And he's involved with Rolling Hills Community Church. He's an assistant teaching pastor there. We've been friends a long time. Mike's got 4 grown children. How many grandkids you have now?
6.
6 grandkids. You might know his daughter, Kelly Minter, who's a prolific women's Bible study teacher and author as well. Mike's newest book we're going to talk some about today is called Stay the Course, A Pastor's Guide to Navigating the Restless Waters of Ministry, a Broadman and Holdman publication, and another book recently called A Western Jesus, the Wayward Americanization of Christ and the Church, also a B&H book. He's got lots of smaller publications you can find on Apple Books that are free of charge. And I could keep talking about his background, but let's just welcome Mike to the broadcast. Thanks for coming on, Mike.
Oh, it's a privilege, and been following you for years, Michael.
Mutual. We need to give a shout out to our friend Captain Retired Navy Bob Riera, a naval pilot who, I guess he introduced us to one another, right?
He did, yeah. I came down to Emmanuel Bible Church. You had just come on board. I don't even remember what year that was, but we licked each other's wounds for a while and would drive up to Bob's to have him console us.
Bob is a fascinating guy. He helped 3 different churches go through massive mission and vision changes, and truly Emmanuel, Reston Bible, and is it Mariners Church in
Mariners? Yeah,
Annapolis. Yeah, he's really been one of these extraordinary laymen that just served Christ so well, and we grow a great debt of gratitude to him. Mike, let's start out first of all. Your book is. I read the preface introduction and I had a cold sweat because I'm going, yeah, I felt all those things when I was in ministry. But it kind of applies to other people in any profession. You have good days and bad days. You have people that drive you crazy, people that encourage you. And I'll probably read a little bit of it, but talk about that intro. Did that take some time to write, or was that just kind of flow when you were putting it together?
That kind of flowed. I seem to have a little bit of a gift for memory of things, and sometimes when I sit down, it just happens. I'm not a terribly organized person. I don't keep journals or records. I don't have one note of any message that I've ever given in 47 years. But I can remember most of them, and at least they're on tape somewhere or filed someplace. But most of that just kind of flowed. I'm actually giving a lot of thought. My kids are thinking of interviewing Kay and me. And as I think back at life and the things I've experienced, all of a sudden things are popping up, and I'm thinking, I need to put that down somewhere. I write almost every week 2 or 3 articles, and then I file them. I don't put them out anywhere. I just put them in a file over here. Occasionally on a little podcast that I have, I'll put something out. But generally speaking, I just put things away and leaving it for posterity, I guess.
Let me read a couple of these things. You talked about, I once grabbed a man just before he tried to kill his wife and mother-in-law. I fled like Elijah from Jezebel. I've been publicly applauded and publicly humiliated. I've made good decisions and bad decisions. I've brought healing to people and wounded them as well. I've had friends leave and others stick through thick and thin. I've driven people from the Lord and brought them to Christ. Sorry, I'm laughing, but I'm just going, yeah, I've done all these things. Guilty as charged. Uh, I've been trapped in the jungles of Bolivia, gotten horribly sick in Latvia, brought a pack of parasite from Brazil. I've watched the most wretched visited the most wretched prisons in Russia, seen cruelty I never dreamed existed. I've been forced out of a bus in the Andes Mountains by guerrillas. I've watched the Amazon River rise so high that people's houses were completely submerged and to climb through a roof to deliver food and the gospel. I've seen the power of the gospel grip hearts and bring eternity to tribes and tongues in various parts of the world. That's a lot of pastors, buddy.
Yeah, I just got back from the Amazon a little while ago, and I'll be heading back out in January. I was going twice a year, and Kay and I agreed that because of my age, I'll be 80 here in a few weeks.
80. Wow.
I've got tons of energy, but it's the time that you fly. You get in at midnight or 1 in the morning, then you take a bus to the hotel, then you get up early and you take the bus, and then when we leave at 1 o'clock in the morning. That's the trying part, not being
Agreed.
there. But I had a couple look at me through a translator, and they said, "You're coming back next year." And I said, "Wait a minute." And they said, "If we can travel 4 or 5 days in a canoe,
Yeah, there's that.
yeah, you can travel in an air-conditioned plane." So I said, "Okay, I'll be back." So Lord willing, if I'm still kicking, I'll be back next year.
I have a friend who goes to India once or twice a year. It takes 3 to 4 planes, 36 plus hour. It's the same way. It's like
Oh,
we Westerners complain about it, but at least we don't have to winter in Malta like the Apostle Paul, right?
yeah.
Sorry, your flight's delayed. We'll talk to you in 6 months. Um, well, let's talk about pastoring in general, because it's not necessarily. In some ways, it's a unique ministry call. And we use a lot of different terms, but what is it about these kinds of experiences that, I mean, the men and women you've known over the years in ministry or just as part of a church, do they get pushed and pulled to these dimensions like pastors?
I don't want to sound like we've got the toughest job in the world. That's not true. I went to a burn center one time and
Yeah,
saw little kids that had been burned. There's a lot of different things. The problem with the pastorate is the dimensions. One day you're doing a funeral, the next day you're doing a wedding. One day you're preaching on this, the next day you're being pulled in this way. The problem with pastoring is you're getting paid weekly to tell people how bad they are. You ever think of that? I mean, you're getting up, you're to reprove, to rebuke, to exhort with all long suffering and doctrine. And so our calling is really unique. It's very, very different because of the dimensions of the emotions of what you're dealing with. You're also dealing with preaching things that you're not personally experiencing maybe that day. Getting up and talking about the power of prayer, and you haven't had an answer to prayer in weeks. And so you're always faced with your own shortcomings. Even preparing a message, you're thinking, now can I say that from the pulpit when I know full well I'm struggling with that myself? There's feelings of hypocrisy. This is why I used to always tell our people, right now, folks, I'm going through a particularly difficult time in this area, but because I'm an expositor and I'm going through a particular book, I'm coming across something that I really don't want to preach on right now. But it's still true whether I'm experiencing it or not. That's what you have to land on. And I think that's what makes it difficult because you're poking your finger to some degree in people's chest. We're never to make people feel guilty, but we are to make them feel convicted. And if they don't respond to the conviction, they're going to feel guilty. So you got all these trappings and things that are a little bit different than another role. My dad was an admiral in the Navy, and I watched him go through difficulties. But it was you sort of had a clear target. You sort of knew what you were looking at. Now times have changed. When I started in 1974, the biggest challenges were some man yelled at his wife or she yelled at him in a fight. Now it's, I think my husband may be transgender or my daughter is experiencing this or that. And you're thinking, what in the world has happened to this society in that period of time. So it's a moving target.
You know, I've talked to younger pastors in the last few years as I've gotten out of, full-time
Right,
being part of a local church, and their issues, as you just articulated, that the trans LGBTQ stuff, the trigger issues,
right,
some of the things people are afraid of. You and I didn't face those. At the same time, it's the context in which we live. It's what they know.
right.
So the problems may be more complex in some respects, but they're still addressed the same way, with
Absolutely.
love, with scripture, with kindness, with confrontation, all these things. But it is in some ways, and we'll get to this, I hope, in a few minutes. It can be a very thankless job in some respects, and I think that's why a lot of people do leave ministry.
That's true. I was, I just blessed. I was surrounded by some really great and very encouraging people. This guy, where I am right now, Jeff Simmons, is the most encouraging pastor I've ever met in my entire life. We just had an all staff. He just gets up and tells everybody, "You're doing a great job. You're the greatest person that ever lived." He slaps you on the back. He hugs you all the time. People love working under his leadership. He's just a gifted guy in that area. I think because I'm pretty much an extrovert, I used to do what I call walk the ship. I would go around to almost every staff office, just stick my head in. How you doing? What do you need? How can I help? And then when I find out what they want me to do, I say, "Excuse me, let me go to the next office." So, uh, but I think I surrounded myself with some really good people. So I don't know that I had some of the toxic stuff. I'm helping a church right now that's going through. They have a toxic leader, and he's been asked to step down. He's a fairly big name. I'm not going to mention it. At any rate, so I'm sort of working through that. And pastors from different places will call me or text me or ask me, "What would you do in this particular situation?" Because I suspect you've been there. And there ain't nothing I haven't experienced. We went through 8 suicides, a murder, several moral failures in those years. And then the problem with that is when you get up and you have to announce that somebody's stepping down, if you say too much, you're violating their privacy. If you don't say enough, the self appointed investigators are going to dig and scoop and say, "You lied to the congregation. You didn't tell us that's what really happened. You led us to believe this." So you're always in that kind of a tension that just makes it very, very difficult. So just, I'm whining now.
No, and the other thing, you and I were trained in a different era, and again, not to besmirch people today, but they don't put the same value, most, in a biblical theological training and a seminary training. It's, you can figure it out. They look at
Right.
the pastorate from a distance. They go, I could do that. I can get up
Yeah.
front and talk. Well, getting up front and talking is about, 2%
Oh,
of what goes on, under the waterline. And we've seen those pictures used variously. The meme, it's an iceberg, and
yeah.
it's got this, it's the sermon, and the
Right.
sermon preps underwater, and there's those agonies that you go through and self-doubt. But what I've noticed is, in some ways, the younger mindset is a little more courageous. They're a little more risk taking than
Okay.
maybe you and I were.
Yeah. I think that's true, but I also think a lot of that's due to the internet. They go online and they see some guy that started a church 6 weeks ago, and now he's meeting in an arena. You've got all the, I better not mention names, but you've got a lot of pastors that have built these enormous churches. I just found out about a pastor, his budget, yearly budget, $100 million. I mean, that's military spending kind of budget stuff. And but very self-promotional, and so I think guys get online and they go, I think I can do that. Well, look at how fast that guy's church grew. If I can just get the right camera angles and just get the right smoke machine and just get the, and so we start going down these paths of trying to be culturally relevant when in fact what you really need is good, solid, biblical teaching that isn't tickling ears because people deep down go, "I don't like it, but I need that." And I think that's why Emmanuel grew under you, and I think it's why Reston grew under me. It wasn't about us. It was about, here's what the word says, and we're going to say it. You may not like it, but we're going to say it and let it do what it's supposed to do.
Well, you and I living in Northern Virginia, D.C., we saw this, and in God's kindness, both Reston and Emmanuel were incredible places to serve. But the churches that came in with flash and big things, and I mean, you experienced it literally when a church opened near you, and you lost a lot of people to the new shiny thing, as it were.
Right.
And so there's always this in Middle Tennessee, as you've perhaps found out living here already. It's very I have another pastor friend that calls them Christian gypsies. We go from one church to the other when we don't like something, and so it's an interesting world to minister in. But I appreciate your comment about a biblical theology, a clear teaching of Scripture. To me, is all that really mattered. And the other things are important, but if you're not in that lane, it is smoke and mirrors. It is entertainment. It is, and I, you know as well as I do, those larger ministries that have $100 million budgets, as you mentioned, I'm sure many people come to Christ.
Oh, they do.
I'm sure the Lord reaches them through all kinds of broken vessels. But at the end of the day, you want to go, Paul said, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Paul. Has Christ been divided? That always haunts me.
Yeah, that's that passage here in Corinthians is just, you naturally have a sense of certain amount of self-worth. Do people like what I'm saying? And you want to get a few attaboys from time to time, or you're going to dry up. You need to have somebody saying, I think you're doing a pretty good job. But you also have to be very, very careful. I wrote an article called Pride in the Pulpit. I can send that to you, but it has to do with our own sense of, am I as good as a guy down the street? When we lost that 1,000 people, that was 20 some years ago. And it was a good church, but it was just doing things that we weren't doing. And God allowed us to not only survive, but our giving went up. And that told me something about the 1,000 people that left. And so you can't always look below that iceberg and know what's down there. You don't always know. But what I've found out, God is gracious enough to let us know that what we have done in the past has meant something. I was my daughter Kelly was speaking at an event in Atlanta about a week and a half ago, and I went down there. There were 15 people there that used to go to Reston Bible Church that live in Atlanta. So they knew who Kelly was. They went. Lady comes over to me and she says, "You don't know me? But in 1995, somebody talked me into coming into RBC. I didn't want to come. I was angry with God, and I had 8 questions that I didn't think he would ever answer me. So I came with my arms folded, and she said, you got up and said, I'm interrupting this series because I feel the Lord wants me to show you how the gospel starts in Genesis 3:15 and how it's revealed all the way through Scripture. When I got finished, she said, you answered every one of my questions in the order that I had them written down, and I called upon Christ to save my soul." I had tears streaming down my cheeks. And I think God just said, Mike, don't don't get so don't think that you failed in every area. And I don't think that. But he just wanted to say, hey, let me tell you something. It's not about you. It's about the power of the gospel. And I will say this over and over again to people. I spoke to the ladies at our church last week. They asked me to address how the gospel is being presented today as opposed to how it was being presented during Paul's day. Is it different? Is it invite Jesus into your life, give him your heart, commit yourself? Or is it the understanding that his righteousness has to be placed to my account and my sin to his account? And so I walked through that. So I said, if the gospel isn't clear, it's very hard for people to come to grips, because a religious person will say, oh, I've given my life to Christ. I've invited him into my heart. And so I'm trying to explain the importance of going back to Pauline gospel theology. It's not just what the gospel is, it's what the gospel isn't. It's not by works of righteousness which we have done, but to him who worketh not, but believes on him. For by grace you saved through faith, and not of yourselves. So I'm trying to get people to understand, when you give the gospel from the pulpit, you need to say what it is and what it isn't. That's what gets a religious person's attention. What? Are you telling me that all those good things I've done don't count? Yeah, Paul used a 4-letter word. He said, it's dung. And there's another 4-letter word that probably could have been spelled out in that. But I mean, he was so passionate about making sure that you understand what it is and what it isn't. And so that's important today. I think we're sort of losing that a little bit, that really hard core biblical preaching that I think this needs to be out there, that's clear enough for people to really look into their heart and say, have I ever really come to the saving knowledge of Christ? Or am I just trying to work my way there? So,
And we've talked about another nationally renowned name, and I kind of dipped my toe in this controversy a bit and talked about clarity, not clever. That we need to be clear, and I appreciate the strong, hard pulpit teaching, but I also think clarity wins the day because the gospel's clear. And when you have to be clever, and you alluded to smoke machines, and you could use that as an allegory or illustration. If it's all wrapping paper, I used to work with some young pastors that were really obsessed about finding an object lesson of some kind, a flash paper of some kind for every sermon. And I would try to encourage them, guys, be clear on the message. If you get a great illustration, wonderful. But if they remember an illustration over the clarity of the passage, you failed. And that's, you mentioned the internet. You can go on the internet and find any illustration, why do you think we're turning our heads away from it? And not just the pastor, but the churches in general seem to, and I don't want to be unkind, but they seem to have lost that focus of a clear message from scripture, whether it's a book of the Bible, or even if you're going to be a topical preacher and preach on, as you mentioned, what's the gospel, or what's love, or what's being a good neighbor. I don't care, but I want to see that text really precisely from what you're saying. That doesn't seem as important anymore.
yeah, I've watched what I would call, it's the frog in the water thing. It's there is a slow simmering of, I need to relate to the culture. And by doing that, I will find clever ways to do it. Now, I'm not opposed to recognizing that times are different and we live in different culture. I understand all that. But I've often told young pastors, as well as maybe older guys, the gospel is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes. So if it really is, you're the Greek guy, the dunamos, I guess is the word. I tell people, I say, you take that gospel, that's the power, not you, and you pull the pin and you throw it into the congregation. And it's going to hit, the shrapnel's going to go somewhere. And some people are going to respond to it and some aren't. But I said, that's your responsibility to let that thing go. And you don't have to be clever about it. If the trumpet gives an uncertain sound, who's going to prepare himself for the battle? Paul says, don't use the wisdom of man's words, lest the gospel be made of none effect. So the issue of clarity is, as you said, it's the key issue. Whether it's the gospel or anything that you're teaching in Scripture, what do I understand to be absolutely clear here, a non-negotiable that I know that I can present and let it do its work? There's another thing that's happened through the years, and that is what used to be called holiness is now called legalism. What I mean by that is, when you talk about holiness and being separated from, sanctified from the world, we're watching things now on TV that we probably never would have watched 20 years ago. I gave a message 35 years ago on what was creeping in. And I'm thinking, boy, Mike, go back and look at that message, listen to it again, because now we're immersed in this stuff. And so if you tell somebody, you really shouldn't be looking at nudity or whatever, oh, you're a legalist, you're a legalist. No, I think it's pretty clear what holiness is. And so I think that's another thing we often have to get back. Not to say the old days, so to speak, but just getting back to the clarity of what Scripture says about these things and be careful in it.
So again, you and I are from a different decade than a lot of these young, well-intentioned pastors. Let's turn the other side of the box. The people in the pew. When you're looking for a church and you find some, it's not like a cafeteria that they don't have this ministry or this ministry. I'm out of here. Local churches can't do everything. But if you're a family in the church and you're going, I don't know if that's right, or theology seems off, but they're really good over here in the programs. I mean, how do you help a person differentiate what church they end up going to?
Yeah, it's interesting. Where I go to church right now, and our pastor knows, when people come to me I've got a Sunday school class I teach, about 100 people that are 60 years and up. We got 100 of them in there. And many times they'll visit that first before they actually go into the service. And they'll tell me, why should I stay at this church? And I'll tell them. I'll say, if you're looking for this, this isn't your church. If you're looking for this is your church. And I don't think that every church is going to be identical. There are some people that could sit under a John MacArthur and really grow. There are some people that wouldn't understand what he's saying. It's just too deep or too whatever you want to call it. They can't grasp some of it. And they would fit better in a church that maybe is a little bit smaller, maybe where the pastor's a little bit more, he's going to come to your house, he's going to visit you in the hospital. And some people look for different things. And I think God in his sovereignty and his providence has allowed different churches to minister in different ways to different people. But the basics have all got to be there. There still has to be a clarity of a gospel-centered preaching. I heard John Stott say that all preaching is expository. He meant that no matter what if you're doing a topical message, you're still expositing that topic. So it's expository. And yet I know what we mean by expository preaching, working your way through a book or what have you. That's what I'm doing right now in our primetime Sunday school class. I'm going through the book of Genesis. I'm fully aware that people are in different stages of life. They understand things differently. And I think God can use, there's some pretty strange people out there that God is using, in my opinion. I had a Pentecostal pastor that I met one time. We were having lunch, and I said, what have you learned through the years? And he said, a lot of strange critters on that ark. The funniest things I ever heard. But I've seen churches just reach people differently, different churches, different styles. I mean, not everybody's going to be exactly the same. I don't think they were meant to be.
I agree, but let me put a little more fine point on it. What is a delimiter? You're visiting a church and they go off into maybe a different view of theology or a different view of something. What's a delimiter? You say you need to be looking for a different church.
That's a good question, and of course there are layers to that. I would suspect. I would want to know. First thing, I think even when you go to a church, when you're sitting under a pastor, there can either be a sense of this guy's haughty, proud, doesn't see life the way I see it. I would want to make sure that pastor is always exalting the person of Christ. It's very easy to get caught up in who you are as an individual. Look at what our church is doing. We're the fastest growing church, and whatever. So you're looking for a humble servant in the pulpit, because God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. And grace is the power to live the Christian life. Paul made that very statement in 1 Corinthians 15:10. He said, it's not I that's doing this, it's the grace of God that's doing the laboring. So I want to sit under somebody, even if I go online, I want to hear somebody that I really feel really believes that message, really believes it's not about them, really believes it's all about Christ, and believes that they are called as a servant of God to deliver a message, even if it's a hard message. I gave a series of messages a number of years ago called The Gospel and Sexuality. It's a 4-part series, because that was when all of a sudden the whole LGBTQ was coming in. It was just ripping the church apart. And they came up with the cleverest, by far, and I was thinking of going into advertising. I was going to be a copyright guy and write ads. I love coming up with little one-liners. But I said they came up with the greatest single marketing scheme I've ever heard. If you don't agree with me, you're a narrow-minded, intolerant, hateful bigot living on the wrong side of history. Genius. Absolute genius. Wrong, but genius. And people bought into it. I don't want to be called hateful and narrow-minded. So I had to address that. And I told people in advance what I was going to be speaking on. And boy, did we have a crowd. You want to get a crowd? Just tell them that's what you're going to be talking about. And but I think it was well received. I tried to let people know that we're all struggling with our sexuality and life, and we're kind of on a level playing field there, but we struggle differently. And I think my one-liner there was, love is not to be construed as agreement, and disagreement's not to be construed as hate. And I wanted people to walk away with that. So that's, yeah.
Probably close to 35 or more years ago, our friend Tommy Nelson did a series called Solomon on Sex,
Oh,
and
yeah.
he turned it into a series and so forth. And he said it was called the motherlode of church growth. And then he said, he said, Michael, I did a series on history, and nobody came back.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. Um, let's talk a little bit more about staying the course. Let me ask for in a generic term. You're working with those over 60. I've been thinking a lot about decades in this last decade of my life, thinking where our minds are at 40, 50, 60. And the mindsets are very different as we enter these decades. What do you see? And let me ask back to the 50-year-olds, the 50s and 60s now, that you've watched their mindset as Christians, how they look at the worldview, their own Christian life, their families.
You mean, are you saying in the group that I'm presently teaching?
Well, yeah. What do you see their concerns? What's
Oh,
because our worldview when we're 20s, we're
right,
scrambling. 30s, we're building a family. 40s, we're probably setting our career. 50s, certainly setting our careers,
right.
and our view of Christianity, our own lives, and worldview, it fluxes as we go in these decades. So, what do you see these men and women in their 50s and 60s focused on?
Yeah, it's interesting. The group that I have, I'm always telling them, they probably get tired of hearing it. We're not dead yet. We still have work to do if you can breathe. We have work to do. And I know that as they ask questions or chime in or share stuff, their tendency, like mine, is to go back to what things were like and now things what they are today. And people in that age group are dealing with children that have gone off the rails and grandchildren that are experimenting, and they're devastated. They're just absolutely devastated at what's going on. So I'm trying to help navigate that and how they can minister to and reach this up and coming generation. The one thing that I'm seeing from my vantage point of looking back is the lack of what I would call logical thinking. Just sheer simple logic. Why would you believe that statement on the internet? Why would you buy into that? Can't you just see that if logic is used, you'll be able to see where this is going to come out in the long haul. Where's this going to end? What's going to be the fruit of this? And so that's kind of what I'm working with them, and also listening to them tell me what they are experiencing in this life at their age.
And I've had the same experience with older couples who are devastated by their children and grandchildren's decisions, and you feel like you've lost your mind because they know what we believe, they know what we taught them, and you're right, logic or just common sense is out the window. So we're kind of in a postmodern mindset.
Right. Absolutely. I don't. I think the clarity of thinking today has been, and there are a lot of studies on this about what's actually happened to the neuroplasticity of the brain due to the amount of time that kids are on cell phones and all of us, and then we're losing our way in the ability to logically reason things out. Here's an intimidating statement that people often use. Well, science says, the statistics prove, the data reveals, studies show. I'm so tired of hearing that, because what studies, what science, what data? Where are you getting this from? But but people hear that and they just automatically log into that, and that becomes part of their thinking, and they've lost the ability to think very, very clearly. If you go back and you read the Puritans, or you go back and read people like Thomas Jefferson or Ben Franklin, you'll see people that are pretty clear thinkers and did a lot of things. But today, that's just slowly disappearing. And people, the internet is now the new discipling program.
That's scary. Yeah, Christopher Yuan, my good friend, we've talked about
Yeah,
this many, many times that it's not about identity or LGBTQ or any of these things. It's about truth. And it's like Lombardi. This is a football.
right.
We got to start over, and even truth is disputed. Well, on that sour note, let me ask you to give us some encouragement. And I want you to think in two audiences. I want you to think of people in the church pew, people that maybe have, got disenfranchised. Maybe they aren't involved in local church because of this, that, or the other thing. And then also the pastor. So kind of get, land this conversation a bit, encourage the pastor and encourage the folks in the pew who are maybe discouraged or a little lost in the process.
Yeah. Here's what I would say to the person in the pew. And there's different types. Some people are doing well. Some are a little disillusioned with church, with life. But the hope is always going to come back to the person of Christ. And everybody's probably going to experience the dark night of the soul somewhere along the line, even though that's not necessarily a biblical term, but it's sort of described in a lot of places in the Psalms. Our hope is always going to be, and I'm learning this more and more, in the providence and sovereignty of God. I cannot fix anything. I'm going through a very difficult time right now with our daughter that's very ill. I can't fix it. I just can't fix it. Uh, and I've come across many times when I thought, I'll never get through this. But here I am. I got through it. And if I didn't get through it and I died, what's wrong with that? I'm in the presence of Christ. So I think we all have to develop a theology of suffering and realize that we're here for a short time. The last statement I made to Reston Bible Church was, life is short, eternity is long, invest heavily in the latter. So I would say to the person sitting in the pew, you can expect there's going to be difficulty. Jesus said it in John 16. In this world, you're going to have trouble. But the person I go back to in Scripture the most is Joseph. I look at Joseph and I keep thinking, it says over and over again, and the Lord was with him, and the Lord was with him. And I'm thinking, did he feel the Lord was with him? Yeah. And I'm convinced he did, because he never gave up. When he got into prison, he said to the guys, my God knows how to interpret dreams. When he was being chased by Pharaoh's wife, he said, how can I do this wickedness and sin against God? So he knew that the Lord was with him. And he's always been an encouragement to me, because he had no idea the many years he was going to be spending in prison and all the stuff. But he comes out on the other side, and he comes out on the other side rather well. There's a lot of pretty interesting things on God's providence and sovereignty in that. So I almost have to rely on that. So if you're in the pew, life's not working out, things are difficult. It's part of life, and it's part of learning to cling to the only one who can give us hope. And so I would end on that note for the person in the pew. For the pastor that's just struggling, church isn't growing, there's discouragement in your own heart. Again, you've got to go back and say, was I called to this? If I was, 1 Thessalonians says, his calling is his enabling. It's not my job to enable myself. It's my calling to rely on the one who will enable me. And I can think of times that I thought, I walked in one day with my resignation letter about 25 years ago. I was just talking to one of the guys that was the elder at that time. I came in, I said, I'm done. I threw it on the table, and he tore it up and said, no, you're not. Okay, now, next. we just kept on moving. And, I look back at those times. God has seen me through so many things that I sit back and all I do is just, honestly, I can almost weep over the things that I've come to. And here I am, almost 80, still kicking, still got some gas in the tank. I don't know how much longer that's going to be. You can see the solar eclipse. I'm dark on this side and I'm light on this side. I don't know where I am. And even the solar eclipse. I mean, come on, tell me. I look at the moon that's 270,000 miles away and the sun that's 93 million miles away, and they're the same size, but they're not the same size. God is screaming to us that he's in charge. I'm sorry, I'm getting worked up, but this is me. I don't even have a pulpit here. Don't just hang in there. It was your prof that used to say, "What are you doing under the circumstances?" And again, one of my favorite lines from him was, "A mist in the pulpit is a fog in the pew." Keep preaching, preach the gospel, don't give up, don't just hang in there. God has got this, and He's going to see you through it if He's called you to it.
Mike Minter, his newest book is called Stay the Course. As always, information in the show notes about our guest, and you can pick that book up anywhere you purchase things online. So take a look at it. It might be a great gift to give to your pastor if he's under encouraged right now, which most pastors tend to be. But Mike, look forward to our next conversation, and thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for your encouragement and friendship.